There is a strange truth hiding inside one of the most beloved Christmas movies ever made. We remember Home Alone as a warm, hilarious childhood fantasy. A boy gets accidentally left behind, discovers the freedom of having an entire house to himself, and then outsmarts two incredibly unlucky burglars with increasingly ridiculous traps. We remember the screaming face, the aftershave, the pizza, the Christmas lights, the snow, and that unmistakable feeling that for a few hours, Kevin McAllister has the greatest childhood anyone could possibly imagine. But watch the movie again as an adult and something begins to feel deeply wrong. Because beneath all that comedy is a story about a child who is forgotten by the people responsible for keeping him safe. And the more seriously you examine that premise, the less Home Alone begins to resemble an ordinary family comedy, and the more it starts to resemble a psychological thriller disguised as a Christmas fantasy. Think about what Kevin actually experiences. He goes to sleep believing his family hates him. He wakes up and discovers that every person he depends on has vanished. There is no explanation, no reassuring voice, no parent coming through the door, no adult immediately correcting the mistake. He is 8 years old, completely alone inside a huge suburban house, surrounded by the physical evidence that his family was there only moments earlier. Their beds are empty, their clothes are gone, their cars have disappeared. The house that previously felt suffocatingly crowded has suddenly become enormous. And yet Kevin doesn't immediately collapse. Instead, he does something psychologically fascinating. He turns the nightmare into a fantasy. He tells himself that he made this happen. He wanted his family gone, and now they are gone. So perhaps this isn't abandonment. Perhaps this is freedom. That distinction is the secret engine of the entire movie. Because Home Alone works precisely because it allows us to experience Kevin's situation through the logic of a child. If an adult were left alone in a mansion without food, transportation, communication, or protection, we would call it terrifying. But Kevin interprets the same circumstances as permission. He eats whatever he wants. He jumps on beds. He watches movies he isn't allowed to see. He plays with toys. He screams just because he can. For a while, the absence of adults feels like the ultimate victory. And then the house starts making noises. The furnace becomes a monster. The basement becomes forbidden territory. Old Man Marley becomes a neighborhood legend. And eventually 2 real criminals appear outside the window. That is when the fantasy changes. Kevin's dream of complete independence slowly becomes a survival story. The child who wanted everyone to disappear suddenly needs the very people he thought he could live without. And that contradiction is why this movie has lasted for more than 3 decades. It isn't really selling children the fantasy of being alone. It is showing them what happens when independence arrives before they are emotionally ready for it. That is also why the movie still works when so many modern blockbusters disappear from cultural memory almost immediately. Home Alone isn't dependent on technology, contemporary slang, or a complicated mythology. Its emotional premise is almost primitive. A child wants freedom. A child is frightened. A child wants to be loved. A child discovers that being powerful isn't the same thing as being safe. The burglars are only the external threat. The deeper threat is the possibility that Kevin's family might never come back. And once you understand that, every laugh in the movie carries a little more weight. The traps are funny because Kevin is finally controlling his environment. The empty house is exciting because he gets to make decisions. The Christmas morning reunion is emotional because the fantasy has finally revealed its hidden cost. Kevin didn't really want to be alone. He wanted to stop feeling alone while surrounded by people. That is a much darker story. And it is also a much more universal one. Because almost every generation understands the childhood fantasy of waking up one morning and discovering that nobody can tell you what to do. No rules. No bedtime. No arguments. No siblings stealing your food. No parents asking where you are going. Just complete freedom. But Home Alone quietly asks the question that childhood fantasies usually avoid. What happens after the freedom becomes real? To understand why that question became the foundation of one of the most successful Christmas movies in history, we have to go back before Kevin, before the Traps, before The Famous House, and even before Macaulay Culkin became one of the biggest child stars on earth. We have to go back to a writer who was preparing for a family trip, worrying about everything that could possibly go wrong, and accidentally discovering the premise of a movie that would define Christmas for generations. That writer was John Hughes. And what began as a simple fear about forgetting something on vacation would eventually become a story about a child discovering exactly how much he needs the people he thought he didn't. Because the real genius of Home Alone isn't that an 8-year-old can defeat 2 burglars. It's that for a few days, the movie makes us believe an 8-year-old might actually be better at handling the world than the adults around him. And then, just before that fantasy becomes completely convincing, it reminds us why he still needs to come home. Home Alone arrived in 1990, looking like a modest Christmas comedy. Nothing about its basic premise suggested that it would become a cultural institution. The concept was simple enough to explain in one sentence. An 8-year-old accidentally gets left behind while his enormous family flies to Paris for Christmas, and 2 burglars attempt to rob his house. But beneath that simple pitch was an unusually powerful combination of elements. A child protagonist audiences could instantly understand. A house that could function almost like another character, villains who were threatening enough to create real suspense but ridiculous enough to invite laughter, and a Christmas atmosphere so carefully constructed that the film eventually became part of the holiday itself. To understand how that happened, this analysis has to go much deeper than simply retelling the plot. Because the making of Home Alone is almost as improbable as the story inside it. We are going to trace the movie from John Hughes' original idea through the studio battles that nearly killed the production before cameras could properly get rolling. We will look at why Chris Columbus became the director, why Macaulay Culkin was so important to Hughes' vision, and how a project initially treated as a relatively small family comedy escaped the expectations placed upon it. Then we will return to the McAllister house itself, because that house isn't just a location. It is the physical language of the movie. When the family is together, the house feels crowded, noisy, invasive, and almost claustrophobic. Once Kevin is alone, the exact same architecture suddenly becomes enormous. Hallways stretch farther. Rooms become playgrounds. Staircases become launch ramps. Windows become observation posts. Doors become barriers. The basement becomes a psychological underworld. The house changes because Kevin changes. And that transformation is one of the most carefully controlled visual ideas in the entire film. From there, we will follow Kevin through the complete story, but not simply as a recap. We will examine what each stage of his journey is doing psychologically. His argument with Buzz. His punishment in the attic. His wish. His first morning alone. His celebration. His fear of the furnace. His encounters with Harry and Marv. His growing confidence. His conversation with Old Man Marley. And finally, the moment when Kevin stops trying to survive the situation and consciously chooses to protect the place he once desperately wanted to escape. We will also look at the villains differently. Harry and Marv are hilarious, but their comedy works because the movie never completely removes the danger they represent. Harry understands that a child is alone in the house. He doesn't simply want to steal property. He recognizes Kevin as an obstacle and becomes willing to hurt him. That makes the final confrontation much more than a sequence of slapstick jokes. In Kevin's mind, the house has become his responsibility, and defending it becomes proof that he is no longer the helpless child everyone dismissed. Then there is Kate. It is easy to overlook Kevin's mother because so much of the movie belongs to Kevin, but Kate's journey gives the story its emotional counterweight. Kevin is learning what it means to live without his family while Kate is learning what it means to be separated from her son. Her desperation transforms the initial mistake from a comedic setup into something emotionally serious. She isn't simply trying to get home because the plot requires it. She is trying to undo the worst mistake of her life. And waiting between these two journeys is Old Man Marley, the character who initially appears to be the monster of the neighborhood, and eventually becomes one of the film's most important emotional mirrors. That is the larger pattern we will keep returning to throughout this story. Expectation versus reality. Kevin expects loneliness to feel like freedom. Doesn't. He expects Old Man Marley to be a killer. He isn't. He expects the burglars to be monsters. They are. He expects his family to be the source of all his problems. Then he discovers that losing them is worse. Even the movie's violence operates through this contrast. The traps look ridiculous, but the physical consequences would be horrifying in reality. The furnace looks supernatural, but its real function is psychological. The mansion looks luxurious, but for Kevin it can feel like a prison. Christmas looks warm and comforting, but it also amplifies the pain of being separated from the people who are supposed to make the holiday meaningful. And that is why this movie matters more than nostalgia alone can explain. For millennials, Home Alone may instantly summon the smell of pizza, the glow of a television screen, the texture of a VHS tape, the sound of Christmas music coming from another room, or the memory of watching the movie during school vacation while eating food that would never have been allowed on an ordinary night. For Gen Z viewers, the nostalgia may be inherited rather than directly experienced in 1990s theaters. The movie arrives through parents, streaming services, television reruns, memes, clips, and annual traditions. But the emotional fantasy remains exactly the same. Every generation understands the desire to be independent before understanding the consequences of independence. That is why Kevin's victory feels so satisfying. He isn't merely defeating criminals. He is proving that the adults who underestimated him were wrong. But there is another detail hiding underneath that satisfaction. Kevin's family doesn't actually need him to become a miniature adult. They need him to stop believing that love and conflict are opposites. The movie begins with Kevin demanding separation. It ends with Kevin waiting for reunion. That is not an accident. It is the emotional arc that makes the traps meaningful. Without it, Home Alone would just be an elaborate collection of increasingly painful jokes. With it, the traps become part of a coming-of-age story. And once you start looking at the film through that lens, dozens of details that seemed completely ordinary as children begin to look deliberate. The positioning of Kevin inside crowded family shots. The repeated emphasis on doors and thresholds. The frightening basement furnace. The Christmas colors filling almost every room. The exaggerated size of the McAllister home. The way silence replaces noise after the family leaves. The score that can turn Kevin's loneliness into wonder within seconds. The carefully timed pauses before the slapstick erupts. Even the final exchange between Kevin and Marley becomes more important than it first appears. Because by that point, Kevin has learned something that the movie never needs to state directly. Home is not valuable because it is large. It is valuable because someone is waiting for you inside it. And perhaps that is the hidden reason Home Alone continues to dominate holiday viewing year after year. Modern movies can have larger budgets, more sophisticated visual effects, faster editing, bigger universes, and more elaborate mythology. But none of those things can replace the emotional simplicity of a child standing at a window on Christmas morning, looking at a family that has finally come back together. The film understands something about nostalgia that many modern productions struggle to reproduce. Nostalgia isn't simply remembering what happened. It's remembering how something made you feel before you understood why it mattered. When we watched Kevin scream into the mirror as children, we laughed. When we watch him do it as adults, we may still laugh. But now we also understand the context. This is a child who believes he has been abandoned. And for just a moment, the movie allows him to believe that maybe abandonment is exactly what he wanted. That is the illusion. The rest of the film is about discovering the truth. And to see how brilliantly that illusion was constructed, we have to begin where the entire nightmare begins. Inside the impossibly crowded McAllister house, on the night before a family vacation, when 15 people are moving through the same rooms, tempers are already rising, and an 8-year-old boy is about to become invisible in a room full of people. Part 2. Context Background. The story of Home Alone begins with an idea that is almost embarrassingly ordinary. John Hughes was preparing for a family trip to Europe and, like many anxious parents, was thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if something important was forgotten? What if the family became separated? What if luggage disappeared? What if, in the chaos of moving a large group of people through airports and hotels, one child somehow got left behind? Most movie premises begin with a dramatic event. This one began with a fear. And that fear became unusually productive for Hughes. He reportedly wrote the script at remarkable speed, developing the basic concept in only a matter of days. The urgency mattered because Hughes understood that the idea didn't need an elaborate mythology. It needed escalation. If a child were accidentally left alone, the first emotional response would be terror, then curiosity, then freedom, then anxiety, then danger, then responsibility, then reunion. The entire movie was already contained inside that emotional progression. But the movie's path to the screen was far less straightforward. At first, Warner Brothers was attached to the project. The studio recognized that Hughes had a strong track record with family-oriented and youth-focused stories, but the production began running into the oldest problem in Hollywood: the difference between what a movie needs and what a studio is willing to spend. The budget became a battleground. The film was not initially treated like the cultural phenomenon it would become. It was treated as a relatively modest comedy, and the studio was reluctant to keep increasing the financial commitment. Eventually, production was shut down. For a movie about a family forgetting a child, there is an almost perfect irony in the fact that the industry itself nearly forgot the project. Then 20th Century Fox stepped in. The studio's decision to rescue the film would become one of the most consequential business moves in its history. Fox was willing to continue where Warner Brothers had stopped, and suddenly the project had a second chance. But it still needed a director. Chris Columbus came into the picture after a difficult experience on National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Columbus had been involved with the project but encountered personality conflicts during development, particularly with Chevy Chase. Rather than allowing that experience to define his career, he moved toward another Christmas movie, one that would ultimately become much more closely associated with his name. Columbus immediately understood that Home Alone needed two things that could easily fight each other. It needed to be funny, and it needed to feel real. If the movie became too realistic, the violence would become disturbing. If it became too cartoonish, the emotional stakes would disappear. The director therefore had to create a world where an 8-year-old could fight criminals with homemade traps, while the audience still cared deeply about why that child was fighting in the first place. Then came the casting of Kevin. This is where Macaulay Culkin becomes essential. Hundreds of children were considered, but John Hughes had become convinced that Culkin was the right actor. That confidence wasn't simply about appearance. Culkin possessed something incredibly difficult to manufacture: the ability to make Kevin simultaneously irritating, vulnerable, funny, intelligent, and emotionally sincere. That combination is critical. If Kevin were too innocent, his early behavior would feel fake. If he were too obnoxious, audiences wouldn't care when he was left behind. If he were too mature, the fantasy would stop feeling like a child's fantasy. Culkin found the balance. He could deliver a line with the confidence of an adult, and then react to a frightening sound with the unmistakable vulnerability of a child. His face could carry the movie's comedy without dialogue, which became especially important once the family disappeared and Kevin had to carry enormous portions of the film almost by himself. The production therefore had a deceptively difficult task. It wasn't just making a comedy about a kid. It was building an entire movie around the emotional credibility of one child actor. And the decision paid off. Yet even after the production found its director and its star, there was still no guarantee that audiences would care. The movie was arriving at the end of 1990, a period when Hollywood was transitioning between eras. The huge blockbuster culture of the 1980s had created an appetite for spectacle. But studios were also discovering the commercial power of high-concept family entertainment. A movie didn't necessarily need spaceships, superheroes, or massive action sequences to become a hit. It needed a premise people could understand instantly. Home Alone had one. The marketing practically wrote itself. A child, a giant house, 2 burglars, Christmas, and that unforgettable image of Kevin with his hands pressed against his cheeks, mouth open, eyes wide in horror. The image became more than promotional material. It became a symbol. Even people who hadn't seen the film could recognize it. Fox reportedly approached the movie with relatively modest expectations. The film was not initially positioned as the unstoppable centerpiece of the holiday season. It was expected to perform, certainly, but there were larger, more established properties competing for attention. And then audiences started talking. This is one of the most important differences between a movie that becomes successful and a movie that becomes a phenomenon. Advertising can make people aware of a film. Word of mouth makes people feel that they have to see it. Home Alone benefited from both. Parents recommended it to other parents. Children talked about the traps. People quoted the dialogue. Families returned to theaters. The movie became an event that didn't feel like an event because everyone treated it as something casual. You weren't going to see a grand cinematic experience. You were just going to see the funny Christmas movie. And then you came out of the theater talking about Kevin. That cycle continued week after week. The film opened strongly and then refused to disappear. Instead of collapsing after the first burst of holiday curiosity, it remained a major attraction through the winter and beyond. Its staying power became increasingly difficult for the industry to explain. The movie wasn't merely being watched. It was being revisited. That distinction would become crucial to its legacy. Because Home Alone contains the kind of structure that rewards repetition. The first viewing is about discovering what happens. The second is about anticipating the traps. The third is about noticing the details. Eventually, the plot becomes familiar enough that the movie stops functioning like a suspense story and starts functioning like a ritual. You know when Kevin will fall. You know when the furnace will appear. You know when Harry will step onto the ornaments. You know when Marv will scream. You know when Kevin will finally see his mother. And yet knowing all of that doesn't reduce the pleasure. It increases it. That is the same principle behind holiday traditions themselves. We don't celebrate Christmas because we are curious about what happens next. We celebrate it because we already know what happens next. Home Alone eventually became part of that emotional architecture. But before it could become a ritual, it had to establish the world that made Kevin's transformation possible. And that world begins with noise. The opening of Home Alone is intentionally overwhelming. The McAllister house is full of people, luggage, food, decorations, arguments, movement, and competing conversations. 15 family members occupy the same environment, and Kevin is simultaneously physically present and emotionally invisible. That contradiction is the foundation of the first act. He isn't alone yet, but he already feels alone. The house itself helps communicate this. Rather than presenting the family gathering as peaceful holiday warmth, the film presents it as controlled chaos. Adults move from room to room. Children argue. Food is being prepared. Suitcases are being organized. Someone is always speaking over someone else. Kevin is a small figure inside an enormous family machine. And his older brother Buzz understands exactly how to exploit that. Buzz's behavior toward Kevin is not merely sibling teasing. He repeatedly humiliates him, invades his boundaries, eats the food Kevin wants, and uses the family's larger social structure as protection. Kevin complains, but his complaints are treated as noise. This is important because Kevin's eventual independence does not come from nowhere. The movie first establishes that the adults around him don't take his emotional experience seriously. He is the child who is expected to tolerate everything. The child who is told to stop complaining. The child who is expected to accept that older siblings have more power. So when Kevin finally explodes, his anger feels earned. He isn't simply a spoiled kid demanding his own way. He is a kid who has reached the emotional limit of being unheard. The famous dinner table confrontation therefore becomes the first major turning point. Kevin wants the family to leave him alone. His parents want him to calm down. Buzz provokes him. The situation escalates. Then the milk spills. The power goes out. And in the chaos, Kevin is punished and sent upstairs. These details may appear random, but they create a chain reaction. The outage disrupts the alarm clocks. The family wakes late. The morning becomes frantic. And Kevin's ticket, accidentally discarded during the cleanup, disappears with the trash. The movie never needs to make a villain out of the adults. Their negligence is enough. That is what makes the premise uncomfortable. Nobody intentionally leaves Kevin behind, but everyone contributes to the possibility. One person doesn't count the children correctly. Another assumes someone else has checked. Someone throws away something that should have been preserved. The family moves too quickly. And the child who already felt invisible becomes literally invisible. When the family leaves, the movie performs one of its most effective transformations. The noise disappears. The crowd disappears. The movement disappears. And Kevin wakes up. For the first time in his life, the house belongs entirely to him. First, he is frightened. Then he realizes what has happened. His wish came true. Everyone is gone. And suddenly the horror becomes a dream. Kevin runs through the house like someone who has just been handed the keys to adulthood, without being told what adulthood actually costs. He eats ice cream. He jumps on beds. He watches forbidden television. He slides down the staircase. He enjoys the luxury of making every decision himself. The camera and production design reinforce this change by making the house feel larger than it did before. Spaces that previously seemed crowded now stretch around him. The same rooms that trapped him in family chaos become playgrounds. But the movie never allows the fantasy to remain completely safe. The basement waits. The furnace waits. The neighborhood waits. And outside the house, Harry and Marv are already watching. Kevin doesn't know it yet, but his greatest problem isn't that his family has disappeared. It's that somebody else has noticed that nobody is home. And while Kevin is learning how to enjoy freedom, the wet bandits are learning how to exploit it. That is when Home Alone stops being a story about a boy who has everything he wants and becomes a story about a boy who has to defend everything he has left. The first time Kevin sees the furnace, it seems like the house itself is alive. The basement is dark, industrial, and visually different from the warm Christmas spaces upstairs. The furnace breathes fire. Its face seems to move. Kevin imagines it as a monster. The symbolism is obvious once we recognize what the furnace represents. It is fear without explanation. It is the thing Kevin cannot control. And that matters because Kevin's entire fantasy depends upon control. He controls the food. He controls the television. He controls the rooms. He controls the schedule. But he cannot control the dark. He cannot control the noises. And he certainly cannot control the criminals approaching his home. Old Man Marley serves a similar purpose. The neighborhood has transformed him into a monster through rumor. Kevin believes the stories because children often turn incomplete information into absolute certainty. Marley becomes another embodiment of the unknown. But unlike Harry and Marv, Marley isn't actually a monster. He is a lonely old man. And that distinction will eventually become the emotional key to Kevin's journey. Before that revelation, however, Kevin has to learn the practical mechanics of survival. He goes shopping. He does laundry. He manages food. He attempts to behave like the adult he imagines he needs to become. The scenes are funny because they are slightly beyond his capabilities, but they are also revealing. Kevin isn't pretending to be independent anymore. He is practicing independence. And every successful task strengthens his confidence. That confidence eventually becomes strategy. When Harry and Marv begin testing the neighborhood, Kevin realizes that simply staying inside isn't enough. He needs to convince them that the McAllister house is occupied. So he creates an illusion. Cardboard figures move behind windows. Lights turn on and off. Music plays. A mannequin becomes a dancing party guest. Kevin turns his house into a stage. And this is where the movie's central idea becomes almost literal. Kevin survives through imagination. The child who once used imagination to turn a terrifying house into a playground now uses imagination to turn an empty house into a fortress. The difference is maturity. At the beginning, imagination helps Kevin escape reality. Now imagination helps him confront it. Harry eventually sees through the deception. He realizes the house is empty. And worse, he realizes that the child inside is alone. At that moment, the stakes change. Kevin is no longer playing. Harry isn't either. The burglars decide to return at 9 o'clock. Kevin hears enough to understand that the next confrontation will be different. He can no longer rely on pretending that his family is home. He has to become the family. Meanwhile, Kate McAllister is discovering what Kevin's absence actually means. Her journey across the country and back toward Chicago provides the emotional mirror to Kevin's growing independence. Every obstacle she encounters becomes more painful, because she knows that the situation began with her failure to make sure her son was with the family. Her desperation also reveals something important about the movie's morality. The film does not permanently punish Kevin's parents. It does not turn the story into an indictment of bad parenting. Instead, it gives Kate a chance to feel the consequences of her mistake, and gives Kevin a chance to understand the consequences of his anger. Both sides need to move. Kevin needs to understand that his family matters. Kate needs to understand that Kevin needs to know he matters. That is why the eventual reunion works without a long speech explaining everything. The emotion is already there. But before Kevin can reunite with his mother, he has to face the emotional center of the movie. He goes to church. And there, instead of confronting a burglar, he confronts his own assumptions. Old man Marley is sitting quietly, and Kevin discovers that the terrifying man from Neighborhood Stories is simply a grandfather who has become estranged from his own family. Marley tells Kevin about the mistake he made with his son and the pain that followed. For Kevin, this is the first time someone has openly explained the cost of allowing anger to become permanent. The lesson lands because Kevin has been doing exactly that. He believes his family doesn't value him. He believes he would be happier without them. He has been treating separation as a solution. Marley's story forces him to imagine what separation could become if it lasted. Not freedom. Loss. Kevin begins to understand that being independent and being disconnected are not the same thing. And that realization changes the direction of the story. He goes home. But now he is not waiting passively for his family to return. He chooses to defend the house. This is the moment when Kevin truly grows up. Not because he becomes stronger. Not because he becomes smarter, but because he accepts responsibility. He knows the burglars are coming. He knows he is scared. And he decides to act anyway. The preparation sequence is therefore much more important than a montage of funny traps. Kevin is building a plan. He studies the architecture. He identifies entry points. He creates obstacles. He turns ordinary household objects into weapons of deterrence. Every trap represents a small piece of his transformation. The child who once couldn't control his family now controls the battlefield. The boy who felt powerless now understands the value of preparation. And the house that once felt like an enormous, frightening environment has become a map that Kevin knows better than anyone. That is why the final act works. The burglars are entering Kevin's world. They believe they understand the house. They don't. Kevin does. The first trap is funny. The next one hurts. Then another. Then another. And with every failed attempt, Harry and Marv become less like competent criminals and more like physical manifestations of Kevin's fears being defeated one by one. But the movie's violence creates an interesting contradiction. In reality, many of these injuries would be catastrophic. A heavy iron falling from above could kill someone. A blowtorch to the head could cause severe burns. A fall down a staircase could produce devastating injuries. Stepping barefoot onto sharp ornaments could cause serious wounds. And yet the movie's tone keeps the audience laughing. This works because the film operates in a deliberately exaggerated physical universe. Harry and Marv are not realistic criminals. They are almost vaudeville monsters. They can survive impossible punishment because their function is symbolic as much as narrative. They are obstacles. They are adults who underestimate a child. They are chaos entering Kevin's newly controlled world. And Kevin defeats them not through brute strength but through intelligence. That is the critical difference. He doesn't overpower them. He outthinks them. Harry is the planner. Marv is the follower. But Kevin adapts faster than either of them. Every time the burglars adjust, Kevin adjusts again. The house becomes a chessboard. And Kevin becomes the player. Until Marley enters. His intervention is not simply a convenient rescue. It completes the emotional circle. The man Kevin once feared becomes the person who saves him. The boogeyman becomes the protector. The lonely old man becomes the bridge back to family. Marley reunites with his daughter and granddaughter, while Kevin finally reunites with his mother. And notice how quiet the reunion is. There is no elaborate speech. Kevin doesn't explain his entire psychological journey. Kate doesn't deliver a monologue about parental responsibility. They simply see each other. And after everything that happened, that is enough. The next morning, the house feels different again. Christmas has arrived. Kevin is no longer alone. The family has returned. The fantasy has ended. But Kevin has changed. He doesn't need to prove that he can survive without them anymore. He has discovered that surviving alone is not the same as living well. Then comes one of the film's smallest and most beautiful details. Kevin sees Marley. The old man has reunited with his family. Kevin watches the embrace. And the visual quietly mirrors his own experience. Marley was afraid of losing his family. Kevin was afraid that his family didn't care about him. Both fears were rooted in the same human need: connection. That is why the final exchange between Kevin and Marley carries so much emotional weight. They don't need words. They understand each other. And then Kevin remembers the one thing that remains unresolved: Buzz's room. The final callback is almost mischievous. The room has been destroyed. The consequences of Kevin's adventure are still visible. The family may have reunited, but life hasn't magically become perfect. And that is exactly right. Home Alone never promises perfection. Promises reconciliation. There is a difference. Kevin still has a difficult family. Buzz is still Buzz. The house is still chaotic. The parents are still capable of making mistakes. But Kevin no longer believes that conflict means he isn't loved. That is the emotional destination of the entire story. And it is what makes Kevin such an unusually effective protagonist. On the surface, his goal is simple. He wants to be left alone. But underneath that goal is something completely different. He wants to be valued. He wants his family to listen. He wants to feel that his existence matters. His anger is therefore less about independence than recognition. At the beginning, Kevin is dependent on everyone around him and deeply frustrated by that dependence. He feels powerless because adults control everything. Buzz controls his space. His parents control his choices. His extended family fills the house with noise. Then Kevin becomes a rule breaker. He realizes that without adults watching, he can create his own rules. But that stage doesn't last. Freedom produces danger. Danger produces responsibility. And responsibility produces maturity. That is the arc. Naive dependent. Chaotic rule breaker. Tactical strategist. Emotionally mature son. The transformation is subtle because the movie never announces it. Kevin doesn't suddenly become wise. He learns through experience. He discovers that fear can be confronted. He discovers that imagination can be useful. He discovers that mistakes have consequences. And most importantly, he discovers that the people he resented can still be the people he loves. That is why the scene with the furnace matters. Kevin cannot simply defeat every fear by turning it into a joke. Some fears have to be faced. The furnace is one. Marley is another. The burglars are the final test. And each one becomes smaller once Kevin stops running from it. The villains themselves are fascinating because they represent almost the opposite trajectory. Harry and Marv are adults who have never developed the emotional maturity Kevin gains in only a few days. Harry is cold, calculating, and focused on money. He is the brains of the operation, or at least believes himself to be. He studies houses. He looks for vulnerabilities. He uses information to exploit people. Marv is different. He is impulsive, childish, easily distracted, and fascinated by his own nickname. Together, they form a classic comedy pairing. Harry thinks he is in control. Marv thinks everything is funny. Kevin eventually realizes that both assumptions are weaknesses. Harry cannot adapt emotionally. Marv cannot adapt intellectually. Kevin can do both. That is why the villains are more than comic relief. They are adult incompetence placed against childhood adaptability. The irony is almost perfect. The adults in Kevin's family underestimate him. The adult criminals underestimate him even more. And the child succeeds because he is forced to take the world seriously. That also explains why Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern's performances are so important. Their physical commitment allows the movie to live between reality and cartoon logic. They react as if every trap is genuinely painful, while the audience understands that the universe itself has become exaggerated. The comedy therefore comes from contrast. Serious faces, ridiculous consequences, realistic reactions, impossible survival. It is the same principle that makes Kevin's own performance so effective. He reacts to absurd situations with genuine childlike fear. That sincerity keeps the movie grounded. The supporting characters reinforce the same emotional architecture. Kate's journey is guilt turned into determination. Gus Polinski, played by John Candy, represents kindness without judgment. He meets Kate at her lowest emotional point and doesn't lecture her. He simply helps. In a movie where so many adults fail Kevin through distraction or incompetence, Gus becomes valuable precisely because he doesn't demand anything in return. And then there is Marley. He is the character who most directly mirrors Kevin. Both feel separated from family. Both are misunderstood. Both are carrying emotional pain. Both need reconciliation. Marley initially appears to be the monster Kevin fears. But the movie reveals that the real monster isn't the lonely man walking through the snow. It is isolation itself. That idea leads directly into the film's larger themes. Home Alone is often described as a movie about independence. But its deeper message is almost the opposite. Freedom without connection is isolation. The fantasy of being completely independent is thrilling only when you know that somebody is still there when you need them. Kevin's house becomes fun because he believes his family will eventually return. If he knew they were gone forever, every luxury would become meaningless. The giant television wouldn't matter. The pizza wouldn't matter. The toys wouldn't matter. The huge rooms wouldn't matter. The house would simply become a monument to absence. That is why Christmas is such an important setting. Christmas is culturally associated with warmth, family, tradition, and belonging. So placing Kevin alone during Christmas creates a powerful contradiction. The lights are glowing. The tree is decorated. The snow is falling. The music is beautiful. And yet the child at the center of the story is separated from everyone who gives those things meaning. The movie uses warmth to make loneliness more visible. That is one reason its emotional scenes work so well. The visual world is saturated with reds and greens. Christmas lights glow against dark windows. Warm interiors contrast with cold exterior streets. Doors separate inside from outside. Windows allow Kevin to watch the world while remaining physically isolated from it. Keys represent access. Thresholds represent choice. And the basement represents everything Kevin doesn't want to confront. The house itself becomes a map of maturity. Upstairs is comfort. Downstairs is fear. Outside is danger. The front door is the boundary between Kevin's controlled world and the unpredictable world beyond it. As the movie progresses, Kevin crosses these boundaries repeatedly. He goes outside. He goes shopping. He goes to church. He enters the basement. He returns to the house. He stops hiding. And eventually he transforms the entire building into his own defensive system. The architecture is therefore not decorative. It is storytelling. The McAllister mansion can also be interpreted as a gilded cage. It represents wealth and comfort, but also emotional distance. There is more than enough space for everyone, yet Kevin still struggles to feel seen. That contradiction reflects a broader element of 1990s suburban culture. The family has resources. They have a huge house. They travel internationally. They own expensive possessions. Yet the thing Kevin needs most cannot be purchased: attention. The film never turns this into a heavy-handed critique of wealth, but the contrast is always present. The house is enormous. The family is enormous. And somehow Kevin is still lonely. Even the fake gangster movie Kevin watches becomes part of this psychological world. Angels with Filthy Souls gives him a distorted model of adult power. The violence and authority of the fictional gangster world are filtered through a child's imagination and then repurposed as a weapon against the burglars. Kevin learns how adults perform power. Then he imitates it. The result is funny, but there is also something fascinating happening psychologically. He is using the tools of a world he doesn't fully understand to protect himself from adults who intend to hurt him. The child becomes the director. The house becomes the stage. The criminals become actors who don't know they're performing. And Kevin becomes the person controlling the narrative. That is why the production design is so important. The film's visual identity is almost aggressively Christmas-like. Red wallpaper, green decorations, warm wood, golden lights, snow outside. The color palette creates a world that feels like a memory before the audience has even finished watching it. It is highly saturated, almost unreal. That is appropriate because the entire story is operating inside a child's emotional fantasy. The violence is exaggerated. The house is enormous. The villains are nearly indestructible. The Christmas atmosphere is almost impossibly beautiful. The movie isn't trying to reproduce reality. It is reproducing the way childhood remembers reality. And that distinction explains why certain technical choices remain so effective decades later. The production relied heavily on practical effects, stunt work, camera tricks, and carefully constructed sets rather than depending on modern digital imagery. The result is tactile. Objects have weight. Snow looks physical. The house feels inhabitable. The traps feel like they exist inside the same world as Kevin. Even when the physics become impossible, the textures remain believable. That combination creates a strange illusion. We know the movie is exaggerated, but we can feel every impact. That is particularly true of the stunts. The physical comedy of Home Alone is much more demanding than it looks. Harry and Marv endure a sequence of falls, burns, impacts, slips, and collisions that required precise choreography and carefully controlled stunt work. The audience experiences the violence as spontaneous. In reality, it had to be meticulously planned. The timing of a swinging object, the angle of a fall, the position of an actor, the camera's perspective, and the editing rhythm all had to align. That precision is one reason the movie still feels different from digitally enhanced slapstick. There is an almost primitive physicality to it. Something hits something else. Someone falls. A surface breaks. A foot lands where it shouldn't. A body reacts. The sound sells the impact. And then the joke lands. Chris Columbus' direction is crucial to that balance. He understood that the movie needed to remain visually connected to Kevin's perspective. Low camera angles make the adults seem larger. Wide compositions make the house feel enormous. And once Kevin is alone, the framing changes with him. He occupies more space. He moves through rooms without adult supervision. The world becomes his. This is one of the reasons the house interior had to be so carefully constructed. The production created an extensive interior environment to allow the camera to move through the space and maintain visual continuity during the trap sequences. The house wasn't simply a background, it was a machine. Every hallway, staircase, window, door, and room needed to support the choreography. And that physical design allowed Columbus to alternate between two completely different rhythms. Silence, then chaos, stillness, then impact. A quiet Christmas morning, then a scream. A slow walk through a hallway, then an explosion of movement. That rhythm is one of the secrets of the film's emotional power. If the movie were constantly loud, the violence would lose its impact. If it were constantly sentimental, the comedy would become exhausting. Instead, Columbus gives the audience room to breathe. John Williams' score takes advantage of those spaces. Williams transformed the film from a simple comedy into something closer to a Christmas fairy tale. The music understands that Kevin's emotional experience is larger than the plot. When he is alone, the orchestra can make the house feel magical. When he is frightened, bells and woodwinds can turn uncertainty into suspense. When the family is returning, the music expands the emotion into something almost sacred. Somewhere in My Memory is particularly important because it gives the movie a musical definition of home. It doesn't simply tell us that Christmas is happy. It tells us that memory itself can become a form of home. The score connects Kevin's present experience with the future memory he will eventually carry. That may be why the film can feel nostalgic even for people who didn't see it when it was released. The music creates an emotional memory that the audience can borrow. The Christmas songs serve a similar purpose. Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree adds playful energy to Kevin's celebration. Carol of the Bells intensifies the final preparations. The songs don't simply decorate scenes. They help control the emotional temperature. Sound design does the same thing. A metal object hitting a surface. A foot landing on glass. A door slamming. A blowtorch igniting. A body falling. These sounds give the traps physical weight. But perhaps the most important sound in the entire movie is silence. When the McAllister family leaves, the sudden absence of voices creates an acoustic version of Kevin's loneliness. The house becomes quiet. Wind becomes audible. Rooms seem larger. Every small noise matters. Silence turns the house from a playground into a mystery. That is why the sound design is not merely supporting the comedy. It is supporting the psychology. And once the film became a success, that psychology became part of popular culture. Macaulay Culkin didn't simply become famous. He became instantly recognizable. The hands-on-face pose became an international image. The movie's dialogue entered everyday language. The fictional gangster line "Keep the change, you filthy animal" became one of the film's most enduring cultural artifacts, despite the fact that it comes from a fake movie inside Home Alone. That is another example of the film's genius. It creates a fictional world inside its fictional world, and audiences remember both. Before internet memes existed in their modern form, Home Alone already had meme-like cultural objects, images, quotes, gestures, scenes, sound effects. People could communicate their reaction to something simply by imitating Kevin's face. That is the definition of cultural penetration. The film did not remain inside theaters. It entered the language of everyday life. Its long-term influence is even more remarkable. Every December the movie returns. Parents who watched it as children introduce it to their own children. The experience becomes generational. The same scenes that once represented childhood freedom now represent family tradition. And that is perhaps the ultimate transformation of Home Alone. A movie about a child being separated from his family became one of the things families used to come together. That contradiction is beautiful. The story begins with separation. The tradition is built around reunion. The house that once felt empty becomes a place families return to every year through memory. And that helps explain why the movie has remained so powerful, even as technology has transformed daily life. There are obvious elements that have aged. Payphones, VHS tapes, the airport experience, the absence of smartphones, the inability to instantly locate a child through GPS. All of these details make the movie unmistakably rooted in 1990, but they also protect the story. If Kevin had a smartphone, the premise would collapse. If Kate could track him instantly, the separation would be solved. If the family had constant digital communication, the mystery would disappear. The technological limitations aren't weaknesses. They are part of the architecture. Home Alone needs a world in which being unreachable is possible. And because that world no longer exists in quite the same way, the movie becomes a time capsule. Not an outdated one, a preserved one. Its technology belongs to the past, but its emotional problems do not. Children still feel overlooked. Families still argue. Parents still make mistakes. People still misunderstand each other. People still fear being abandoned. And people still discover that independence without connection eventually becomes loneliness. That is why the critical debate around Home Alone is so interesting. Some critics immediately recognized the film's charm, but questioned the extreme violence of the third act. From an adult perspective, the traps are absurd. The physics don't work. The criminals should be severely injured. The police response raises questions. The family's failure to realize Kevin is missing becomes increasingly difficult to defend. And yet audiences didn't care. Or rather, audiences cared about something else. They cared about the fantasy. A child has been underestimated by everyone. Then two adults who believe they can overpower him enter his world. And he defeats them. That emotional equation is nearly impossible to resist. Critics looking for realism found contradictions. Audiences looking for wish fulfillment found liberation. Both responses can be valid. Home Alone absolutely contains logical problems. Its medical reality is ridiculous. Its parenting logic is questionable. Its villains survive injuries that would probably be fatal. But demanding realism from a film whose entire premise is an 8-year-old turning a suburban house into a tactical fortress can miss the point. The movie is not asking us to believe this could happen exactly as shown. It is asking us to believe how it feels. That is a different kind of realism. Emotional realism. And emotional realism is why the movie survives. Because underneath every impossible trap is a recognizable feeling. The desire to be heard. The desire to prove yourself. The fear of being forgotten. The need to forgive. The fear of growing up. The longing to return home. That is also why the film's financial success became so extraordinary. Made on a comparatively modest budget, Home Alone ultimately earned hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide and became one of the most profitable movies of its era. Its success changed expectations. Studios saw that a child-centered comedy could compete with major blockbusters. The movie's profitability helped strengthen 20th Century Fox's position in family entertainment. And naturally, a phenomenon like this could not remain a single movie. A sequel followed. Then additional sequels, games, merchandise, television appearances, references, imitations, and countless movies built around variations of the same basic fantasy. Children versus incompetent adults. A young protagonist using intelligence instead of physical power. A familiar home transformed into a battlefield. A simple high-concept premise escalating into chaos. Home Alone didn't invent every element of that formula, but it demonstrated just how commercially powerful the combination could become. Its influence spread far beyond direct sequels. Filmmakers learned from its spatial comedy. Writers learned from its simple premise. Studios learned from its family appeal. And audiences learned that a movie could become a yearly ritual without needing to change. That ritual eventually became part of its historical significance. Home Alone was eventually recognized by major cultural institutions, including its selection for preservation in the National Film Registry. That recognition matters because it confirms something audiences had already known for years. The movie wasn't merely popular. It was culturally important. Its practical filmmaking, visual design, music, performances, and emotional structure represented a particular moment in American cinema. John Williams received an Academy Award nomination for the score, while the film's music became inseparable from Christmas itself. But perhaps the most interesting part of the legacy is what hasn't changed. The film still works when stripped of its 1990s technology. The VHS tapes can become nostalgic props. The payphones can become historical details. The airport procedures can look dated. But Kevin's emotional journey remains contemporary. A child wants to be taken seriously. A mother desperately wants to repair a mistake. An old man wants to reconnect with his family. Two criminals underestimate the person standing in their way. Nothing about those conflicts belongs exclusively to 1990. That is why the film continues to be rewatched. Not because every detail is perfect. It isn't. Not because every joke has aged flawlessly. It hasn't. And certainly not because the traps make medical sense. They don't. The movie survives because its emotional architecture is unusually strong. The setup is immediate. The escalation is natural. The character relationships are clear. The visual world is unforgettable. The music is iconic. The casting is almost impossibly precise. And the ending gives audiences exactly what the story has been promising from the beginning. Home. Not the building. The feeling. That is the real achievement of Home Alone. It takes a premise about separation and turns it into a celebration of belonging. It takes fear and turns it into courage. It takes loneliness and turns it into empathy. It takes a child who thinks he doesn't need anyone and teaches him that needing people isn't weakness. That may be why the movie has never really stopped being relevant. Every December, millions of people return to the same house. They watch the same boy. They hear the same music. They wait for the same traps. They laugh at the same injuries. And then, almost without realizing it, they wait for the same emotional moment. Kevin sees his mother. Marley sees his family. The house fills with people again. The silence disappears. And the child who once celebrated being alone discovers that the thing he wanted most was never solitude. It was to know that somebody would come back. That is the final lesson hiding beneath all the comedy. Fear becomes smaller when you face it. Independence becomes meaningful when it leads you toward responsibility. Forgiveness becomes possible when anger stops being more important than love. And home is not ultimately defined by walls, possessions, Christmas lights, or the size of a suburban mansion. Home is defined by the people you can return to. That is why, more than 30 years later, Home Alone doesn't feel like a movie that has simply survived. It feels like a memory that learned how to stay alive. And maybe the most beautiful part is that the memory changes as we do. As children, we watch Kevin and dream about being left alone. As teenagers, we watch him and admire his independence. As adults, we watch Kate running desperately across the country and realize how terrifying the premise really is. And eventually, if we are lucky, we watch the ending and understand what Kevin has learned. Being alone can be exciting. Being capable is important. But being loved is something else entirely. And that is why every December, when the lights go up, the snow falls, and that familiar music begins, we return to the McAllister house all over again. Not because we have forgotten what happens, because we remember exactly how it feels.